And there it is. I sacrificed my life to defeat the Eldrazi menace once and for all. At least my best friend Toot Toot was able to survive. I'll always remember his cute ribbits. But I have heard of things being brought back from the graveyard. If I can find a phoenix, maybe I can ride it back to my precious Toot Toot. If we're hunting a phoenix, let's talk about what a phoenix surrounds itself with. The Izzet Phoenix deck. What this deck does is put a lot of cards into its graveyard through cantrips like Consider and Opt and Sleight of Hand, removal spells like Lightning Axe and Fiery Impulse, and things that literally mill cards like Free the Fae, or things that loot like Ledger Shredder, in order to do two things. The first thing is to cast Treasure Cruise to be able to refill your hand and keep doing it. The second thing is to bring back Arclight Phoenix by casting a lot of really cheap instants and sorceries with an Arclight Phoenix already in your graveyard, and control the board, tempo out your opponent, bring back 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 Phoenixes, and win in just a turn or two. So now that we know what we're looking for, let's move to another part of the graveyard. This part's kind of spooky. So let's talk about all the cards in the Izzet Phoenix deck. As far as lands go, you're going to be playing Hall of the Storm Giants just as another card that can come in untapped in early turns, and then in the late game be able to just end the game as a 7/7 with Ward that you can man up for 6 mana. We're playing 3 islands because blue sources coming in untapped is the most important thing in this deck. An Otawara just because it's free, where we can pay 4 mana and return a permanent to the hand. Riverglide Pathway as an untapped red and blue source. Firebluff Canal as an untapped red and blue source you can play very early on. Steam Vents, and yes, another untapped red and blue source. And just to round it out, a 1 of Stormcarved Coast, because odds are we won't need to play that in the first 2 turns. As far as our cantrips go, we're playing Consider, which is instant Surveil 1. So look at the top card of your library, put it in the graveyard or back on the top, and then draw a card. This is probably our best cantrip because it allows us to fill up our graveyard if we want to, and it's instant, it leaves mana up. Opt, which is also instant but slightly worse in this deck, you scry 1 and draw a card for 1 blue mana. It's a little worse because we want to be filling our graveyard, and scry is to the bottom of the library, not the graveyard. And then our worst cantrip, but it's still a very good cantrip, Sleight of Hand. Look at the top 2 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand, 1 on the bottom of your library. Notably with Sleight of Hand, you're not drawing a card. So things like Shieldred don't actually trigger on Sleight of Hand, which is kind of neat. As far as removal spells, we're playing 4 Lightning Axe. Is 1 mana and discard a card. We're almost never going to pay the full cost to deal 5 damage to something. This is really good because it allows us to fill up our graveyard, get those Arc-like Phoenixes in the graveyard, and 5 damage kills most things that we care about. We're playing 3 Fiery Impulse, which very often is just 1 mana creature Lightning Bolt, and a 1 of Torch the Tower because sometimes exiling is super relevant, especially in the mirror match. As far as main deck counter magic goes, we're just playing 2 Spell Pierce. We're keeping it cheap because we don't want to have a lot of lands on the battlefield, and we want to be using those lands to fill up our graveyard to do the Arc-like Phoenix combo. We're playing 4 Ledger Shredder, which is a 1/3 flyer that when any player casts the second spell of the turn, you draw a card and discard a card. So that includes you and your opponent, which I realize when you play in paper is a pretty hefty responsibility paying attention to that. But Ledger Shredder can get pretty big if it's not answered and become a win condition on its own, and allows you to fill up the graveyard very, very quick, get those Arc-like Phoenixes out of your hand and into the graveyard, and rewards you for casting multiple spells, which this deck is very good at doing. Picklock Prankster is an adventure card where its adventure is an instant called Free the Fae, where it's 2 mana to mill the top 4 cards of your library and put an instant or sorcery card from among the milled cards into your hand. This is really good because it fills up your graveyard, you grab instants or sorceries, which is most cards in your deck, and it's exactly what the deck wants. And you can cast it on its creature side after you do the adventure, or before I guess, to have a 2 mana 1/3 flyer with Vigilance, which is decent chip damage and decent blocker. And I guess just something to do with your mana in the late game. We're playing 2 Proth's Eidetic Memory. It's a 2 mana legendary enchantment that when it enters, you draw a card and you have no maximum hand size. That's not super relevant, though it is kind of relevant if you have like a multiple Treasure Cruise draw. But at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've drawn more than 1 card this turn, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn -1. So all the extra cards that you drew, you make a creature that much bigger forever, which can just end the game and is insane with the Vigilance creature like Picklock Prankster. This deck is very good at drawing cards, the cantrips, which again, Sleight of Hand isn't drawing a card, which again makes it kind of worse. But if we combine this with a Treasure Cruise or multiple Considers or Ops, something can get very, very big, and we can turn something like a Picklock Prankster into a must answer. Playing 1 of Brazen Borrower, having an unconditional 1-turn removal is really important against like reach cards or things like Unlicensed Hearse the turn before we want to go off.
We're playing 4 Arc-like Phoenix, so what the deck is totally based around, which is a 4-mana 3/2 with flying and haste. And at the beginning of combat in your turn, if you cast 3 or more instant sorcery spells, you can return it from the graveyard to the battlefield, and since it has haste, it can attack immediately. That's what the entire deck is based around. And the glue that holds the deck together is 4 treasure cruises. We're trying to fill our graveyard anyway because of Arc-like Phoenixes, and so it combos with the deck incredibly well. Very often, treasure cruise ends up being 1 mana, draw 3 cards, which is like a vintage staple. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing Aether Gust, which is 2 mana instant. Choose target spell or permanent that's red or green. Its owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. This is just really decent, not just removal, but also counter magic against like the green decks. 1 Disdainful Stroke, so we can kind of stop people from going big. 1 Negate for decks that have non-creature spells that we care about. 3 Mystical Dispute for blue decks. Another Brazen Borrower in case there are permanents like we talked about. We can go up to 2. 2 Young Pyromancer to diversify our threats. A 2 mana 2/1 that creates a 1/1 whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. Very good with this deck. 2 Anger of the Gods for those creature-based aggro decks. An Ashiok Dreamrender, which is good against decks that search their libraries a lot or use their graveyards, like the Mirror Match. And 3 Crackling Drake, which is again, very, very good against decks that have a lot of removal, just to diversify our threats, have more things our opponent cares about, especially since Crackling Drake doesn't really care if instant sorceries are in your graveyard or in exile, so you're not punished by treasure cruising or for them exiling your graveyard or anything like that. Oh, I see a flame over there. I think someone is casting multiple instant sorceries in the same turn. This is my chance. But as I sneak up on this Phoenix, let's talk about the flex slots of the deck. There are 4 flex slots in the main deck. In those slots, I'm playing the 1 of Brazen Borrower, the 2 Proph's Izzet Memory, and the 1 Torch the Tower. In those slots, you can play 1 Artist Talent, the 4th Fiery Impulse, 1 Galvanic Iteration, 1 Prismari Command, the 3rd Spell Pierce, 1 Spike Field Hazard, or 1 Temporal Trespass. A kind of note about those flex slots: if you're playing either Galvanic Iteration or Temporal Trespass, you play them together because it's kind of a combo. As far as the sideboard goes, there are actually 7 flex slots, so there's a lot of ways that you can change it up. I'm playing the 2nd Anger of the Gods, the 1 Brazen Borrower, the 3rd Crackling Drake, the 1 Disdainful Stroke, 2 Young Pyromancer, and the 3rd Mystical Dispute. In any of those slots, you can play the 2nd Ashiok Dreamrender, 1 Beacon Bolt, 2 Brotherhood End, 1 Prismari Command, 1 Tears of Valakut, 3 Thing and Ice, 1 Third Path Iconoclast, or 1 Unlicensed Hearse. Okay, I'm sneaking up on the Phoenix. It's time to get out of this place. So let's talk about some of the synergies that have to do with this deck. First off, the Ledger Shredder sequencing is so important and probably the most skill-intensive part of this deck. Generally, you don't want to jam out Ledger Shredder on turn 2 just to get it answered. You always want to put yourself in a position that if Ledger Shredder is on the battlefield, you want to be casting 2 spells a turn. So Ledger Shredder on turn 3, following it up with a Consider or a Cantrip or something like that, or maybe even a removal spell, trigger Ledger Shredder and start getting those cards through your hand, get cards that you don't want in your graveyard, get those Arc-like Phoenixes in your graveyard. Filling up your graveyard for Treasure Cruise is a really pivotal part of this deck. Proph's Izzet Memory really cares about Treasure Cruise and Opt and Consider, but again, remember that sleight of hand is not drawing cards, even if it feels like it, but Ledger Shredder is. And so make sure you count the amount of cards that you're drawing. A really silly interaction, but actually a very relevant interaction, especially in like this iteration of Pioneer, is that Leyline of the Guild Pack makes permanents green, because it makes them all colors, or at least creatures green. It makes them all colors, which means Aether Gust interacts with even non-green creatures when your opponent has a Leyline of the Guild Pact on the battlefield. Remember, you can mill yourself with Ashiok and still exile your opponent's graveyard. And if you're playing the Galvanic Iteration Temporal Trespass combo, remember to try to set up a turn where you can do them in the same turn, so you can take 2 extra turns. So spend all your mana doing that, especially if you can also bring back Phoenixes that turn, and then you get 3 attacks with the Phoenix, because you can take 2 additional turns. I have to be careful though, because Izzet Phoenix is really known for being able to adapt to other decks. Let's talk about how to sideboard. In the Mirror Match, you want to bring in 3 Mystical Dispute, the Ashiok Dreamrender, and the Negate, and take out the Brazen Borrower, 3 Fiery Impulse, and 1 Lightning Axe. Against Gruul aggro and Mono Red aggro, you're going to want to bring in the 2 Anger of the Gods and the Aether Gust, and take out the Brazen Borrower and 2 Sleight of Hand. Against Azorius Control, we have a pretty big sideboard. We're going to be bringing in the Brazen Borrower, the 2 Young Pyromancer, the 3 Crackling Drake, the 3 Mystical Dispute, the 1 Negate, and the 1 Disdainful Stroke. We're going to be taking out the 1 Torch the Tower, 3 Fiery Impulse, 4 Lightning Axe, 1 Ledger Shredder, and the 2 Proph's Izzet Memory. Against Niv-to-Light, we have another pretty massive sideboard. Going to be bringing in the 3 Mystical Dispute, the 1 Disdainful Stroke, 1 Negate, 1 Aether Gust, 3 Crackling Drake, 1 Ashiok, and 2 Young Pyromancer. We're going to be taking out the Brazen Borrower, the Torch the Tower, 3 Fiery Impulse, the 4 Lightning Axe, 2 Ledger Shredder, and 1 Treasure Cruise. Against Azuria Spirits, we're bringing in the 2 Anger the Gods and the 3 Mystical Dispute. We're going to be bringing out the Brazen Borrower, the 2 Spell Pierce, and 2 Sleight of Hand. Against Mono Black Discard, we're bringing in the Brazen Borrower, the Negate, 3 Crackling Drake, and 2 Young Pyromancer. We're bringing out 3 Fiery Impulse, 1 Torch the Tower, 1 Lightning Axe, and 2 Ledger Shredder. Against Izzet in Soul, we're bringing in a Negate, 3 Mystical Dispute, and 1 Brazen Borrower. We're bringing out 2 Proph's Eidetic Memory, 2 Sleight of Hand, and 1 Ledger Shredder. Against Hidden Strings, we're bringing in the Brazen Borrower, we're bringing in an Ashiok, we're bringing in an Aether Gust, we're bringing in 2 Young Pyromancer, a Disdainful Stroke, a Negate, and the 3 Mystical Dispute. We're bringing out the Torch the Tower, the 4 Lightning Axe, the 3 Fiery Impulse, 1 Arc-like Phoenix, and 1 Ledger Shredder. And finally, against Nykthos Ramp, we're bringing in an Aether Gust and a Disdainful Stroke, and taking out a Brazen Borrower and a Spell Pierce. Overall, this deck is incredibly synergistic, and in the hands of a good pilot is always going to be incredibly good. Though it's pretty hard to play, so if you're not a great pilot, I could see you losing a ton with it, and the best pilots just destroy even bad matchups. So it's sketchy when you're sitting across the table from somebody you don't know playing it. The deck is all around very, very good. If people choose to beat it, people can totally beat it. It does have bad matchups, and people can play more Graveyard Hate and, and stuff like that. But there's always play, especially play around it, with the sideboard and all the flex slots in the sideboard. There's the Phoenix. Let's catch a ride. I'm getting out of this graveyard.